非常著名的一个国际大师哈。我刚刚算了一下，他今年年纪大概73岁。那他在很多 field 都是很多 landmark 的 contribution， 像很多 GABA， 还有一些 serotonin 等等的。那他也是一个刚刚讲周主任讲他是一个 crazy 的教授哈。我想他很奇特是在他那个药瘾方面哈，那他有很多不同的 policy 的一个见解。那后来跟政府单位意见不同，就退出了组织哈。然后他现在很着重在一个 psychedelic 哈。那像我们最近是 CIMP 的那个理事，我最近在审一些国际的一个 symposium， 最近 psychedelic 的那个 paper 真的是非常非常的多哈。又回到我们以前讲致幻剂，那未来在一个精神医学的未来是怎么样？那他最近在NEJM 发了一些蛮重要的 paper， 那他用那个 psilocybin 他去治疗 depression， 然后他会发现他的一个 brain 的一个 functional connectivity 整个大幅的增加。那这个那个 psilocybin 有这个，可是我们的 antidepressant 没有。那我想可能大家有一些病人吃过像魔幻迷菇，一吃我们那个病人大致要吃一次，他觉得他整个 depression 从天治不好都好了。所以真的是一个非常 amazing 的一个 topic。那因为今天时间的关系，所以他没有办法跟我们 online 的 Q&A。不过这个题目，我想他今天一定会讲得非常非常的精彩。那大概是有30分钟的演讲。那我们现在就来播放这个影片。
Good morning. My name is David Nutt. I'm a psychiatrist and neuropsychopharmacologist at Imperial College London. And today I'm going to give you a talk about psychedelics in psychiatry. I'm sorry I can't be with you, but hopefully some future date I will. So now I'm going to switch off my screen and go to my presentation. So this is the title of my talk. And the next slide shows the range of different psychedelic agents we have. The top left, you have mescaline from the peyote cactus, psilocybin from magic mushrooms, ayahuasca, which is a drinkable form of DMT. Two plants are put together, one which makes DMT, the other has a monoamine oxidase inhibitor such as harmine present to prevent the breakdown of DMT. The bottom right corner, we have Amanita muscaris, a different kind of psychedelic which works through the GABA system rather than the serotonin system. And I won't be talking more about that today. On the bottom left, you have the plant morning glory and the ergot fungus, which grows on cereal crops. And the bottom left-hand image is the one that is perhaps most relevant because the ancient Greeks knew that the combination of ergot, which makes a weak form of lysergic acid, and alcohol was a very powerful one for opening the mind, for allowing them to engage better in art and dance and theater and music. And they used it to fuel what were called the Eleusinian mysteries. And you can make the case that psychedelics potentially contributed enormously to the development of ancient Greek culture. And of course, most Western culture is based on their discoveries such as philosophy, logic, geometry, and of course, democracy. Now, this image here shows the remarkable rise and fall of psychedelic research in the 1950s. Psilocybin was introduced into medicine in the mid-50s, LSD even before. And this graph here shows the number of publications each year for these two different medicines. And you see a rapid increase over the 1950s and 60s, and then a precipitate fall. And the reason for that fall is shown by the red arrow. The red arrow shows where the US government and then the United Nations banned these drugs. And they banned them because they were fueling the, or thought to be fueling the anti-Vietnam War protests. And you can see that in the image on the bottom right here. And of course, the anti-war protests soon were successful and the war was ended, but the war on drugs didn't end. And in fact, it led to this cataclysmic fall off in research because these drugs were put in the most harmful category. They were put alongside drugs such as crack cocaine and crystal meth, and they were said to have no medical value, when up to this point, they'd shown a massive value. And that's illustrated on this slide here, where there were hundreds of psychiatrists around the world who were exploring psychedelics. 140 grants funded by the US National Institute of Health. That led to 1,000 clinical papers, which studied 40,000 patients, 40 books, 6 international conferences. And after these drugs were banned, Masters and Houston pulled together a major review and came to the conclusion that LSD and psilocybin were safe and effective treatments. And here's just a snapshot of some of the papers which were published in the 60s and 70s about the value of these drugs. And these were published in the top journals, and these were studies that were coordinated and written up by some of the top psychiatrists at the time. And they showed 2 major things: wide use and considerable safety, with very low levels of psychosis and very low levels of suicide. So these drugs were shown to be safe in those 1,000 papers that were published before they were banned. And here is a conclusion from Masters and Houston. Treatment with LSD is not without acute adverse reactions, but given adequate psychiatric supervision and proper conditions for its administration, the incidence of such reactions is not great. And of course, as I will show you later, using psychedelics in medicine can encourage people or allow people to have a reliving of the experiences which cause them great distress and trauma. But those interactions, those memories, can be very therapeutic. I'm going to talk about what we know and what we don't know. And if you want to read more about our thinking, this paper was published in Neuropharmacology about a year ago now, but I have to say it's still pretty up to date. It covers most of the issues which still need to be understood and resolved. So what we know? Well, we know that the drugs that I mentioned already, DMT, mescaline, LSD, psilocybin, they all work as agonists at the 5-HT2A receptor. And this graph here in the bottom left, this shows the strong relationship between the clinical dose and affinity at this receptor. These are all agonists at the 5-HT2A receptor. We also know that antagonists of the 2A receptor, such as risperidone and mirtazapine, will block the effects. So we're very confident that the psychedelic experience is mediated through the 5-HT2A receptor. And these receptors are illustrated in this PET scan on the right-hand side here. And you can see the highest density of the 2A receptors are in these parts of the cortex, very low levels below the cortex, which is one reason why psychedelics have very little impact on physiological function. In fact, they have relatively little impact on motor and sensory functions. You can see that the sensory motor strip is relatively low in them, and also the visual cortex. Where these receptors are at their highest density is in those parts of the cortex which have most recently evolved, those parts which make humans different from other primates. These cortical regions are called transmodal cortex, and they're the parts of the brain which produce the communication between the brain that distinguishes humans from other species in terms of creativity, imagination, planning, possibly even socialization. We also know that these 5-HT2A receptors are highly expressed on layer 5 pyramidal cells, and these are the cells which communicate across the brain. As you probably know, the brain is like a 3-dimensional computer, with the primary computing being done at the level of cortical columns, such as shown here, but then the integration of the sensory inputs and also the cognitive generated constructs, the integration of those across the brain is made by these layer 5 pyramidal cells. They're the you might consider them to be the phone network of the brain, bringing it all together. And they have a lot of 5-HT2A receptors, and when you stimulate those receptors, these neurons, these pyramidal cells depolarize powerfully, and that depolarization alters the function of these neurons in terms of integration. And that produces what we call an entropic state, a state of very different from the normal rhythmic activity of the brain. It's a very desynchronized state. And that's exemplified by the decreased segregation between the networks of the brain. So as you probably know, the brain runs multiple different programs simultaneously. And those are differentiated. And the more differentiated they are, we call it, the more modular the brain is. And psychedelics break down that modularity, that network segregation, and increase connectivity between brain networks. And that explains the psychedelic state to some extent. But it also, I think, helps explain why these drugs have therapeutic value, because they change the way that the underlying routine processes of the brain are orchestrated. We also know that other drugs like ketamine and salvia can produce similar increases in cortical entropy, but these work on different receptors and they have different subjective experiences. But certainly in the case of ketamine, they may well also have considerable therapeutic value. So here is a whole series of magnetoencephalographic images of the brain on different drugs. What we're looking at here, in each column, we have a different drug, and in each row, we have a different frequency domain. So this is like EEG, but with slightly better specificity. And what you see here in the right-hand side, in the red box, you see three drugs: LSD, psilocybin, and ketamine. And you can see that they produce a profound reduction in synchronization of brain activity. They desynchronize the brain. That's the entropic brain. Blue means less power in these frequency domains. Across here, you see GABAergic drugs, which synchronize the brain, producing states of altered consciousness, such as sedation, and in the case of propofol, anesthesia. And these are states where the brain becomes hypersynchronized, so that thinking is not possible. And so this graph really shows very clearly the differentiation between the drugs which sedate and synchronize and drugs which desynchronize and produce altered ways of thinking. This is an image which has now become almost a meme for psychedelics. It shows the massive increase in connectivity that occurs during a psychedelic trip. On the left-hand side, you see the normal integration of the brain. These are measures of connectivity in terms of synchronous changes in activity in the fMRI. And you can see most of the activity, most of the synchronization is around the edge. We call this the small brain network. Auditory cortex talks to auditory cortex, visual cortex to visual cortex. Of course, there has to be some cross-brain communication. If you see a bus bearing down on you, then you've got to get your legs moving. But the brain is a very, very efficient computer because it embeds most of its working in these small local world networks, the small world networks. And that is fantastic for efficiency. But of course, if you embed thought processes, such as in depression, I'm a worthless person, or in OCD, yeah, I'm going to be contaminated. If you embed those thought processes in such a way that they're recurrent, they can be very hard to break. And psychedelics, by disrupting the processes of segregating the brain, produce connections which, for most people, have not been present since they were a child. And one of the theories of education is we take a brain in which all things are possible, all connections are possible, and we gradually teach it over decades to become a much more efficient brain. But as I say, the possible cost of getting locked into thought processes which are not that adaptive. So psychedelics open up the brain, increase connectivity, and they can, we believe, allow patients to see things differently. Now, that increased connectivity, we believe, is a powerful mediator of the clinical data. And here are some of the important clinical studies. So this is the first one we did now, 10 years ago, when we took people with treatment-resistant depression who'd failed on at least 2 antidepressants and failed on CBT. We gave them a single dose of psilocybin gave them a trip. And you see the profound reductions in depression scores, with half of them becoming in remission at just a week. In fact, in reality, a day or two after the dose. And some are still well now, but for the majority, the depression creeps back. But nevertheless, over the 3 months of this study, this is the most powerful single dose intervention in resistant depression there's ever been. Now, there have been replications. On the right-hand side here, you see a direct replication by the Compass Pathways team, where you see a profound reduction in depression scores in treatment-resistant patients on a high dose, a 25 milligram at trip dose. And that persists so that you've got a quarter of patients in remission at 3 months, whereas the lower doses, the 1 milligram and the 10 milligram dose, which do not produce trips, but which would in which the patients were given the same level of psychotherapy, produce much poorer outcomes. And the middle here is an interesting study from Johns Hopkins, where they took people with depression and randomized them either to a single dose of psilocybin or to waiting list. And you see the psilocybin produces a profound reduction in depression scores, and waiting list doesn't. And then the waiting list group were given psilocybin, and they mostly got better. And this study has now gone out to a year, showing significant benefits are persistent for the long time. And there are also studies in Brazil and with ayahuasca. And there's also one study that's not yet been published showing the same kind of effect in depression with DMT. And clinically, we also know something perhaps surprising, but very interesting. A psychedelic trip with psilocybin can powerfully change people's addictions. On the left-hand side, here you see smoking. The study from Matt Johnson showing that a couple of psilocybin trips produced almost total abstinence from smoking in 12 out of 15 smokers. And that's such a powerful outcome that he went on to follow it up. We're comparing a 1 dose of psilocybin versus a nicotine patch, and showing that twice as many people were abstinent using psilocybin than following a nicotine patch. And now the US National Institute of Drug Abuse have funded a psychedelic study for the first time in smoking cessation, because of course this is the leading preventable cause of death in the world, with over 7 million smokers a year dying. On the right-hand side, you see a very recent paper from Michael Bogenschutz's team, where they compared 2 doses of psilocybin with 2 doses of an active placebo, which is the antihistamine diphenhydramine. And they were looking at people with alcohol use disorder, and they were looking at measures such as heavy drinking days, days abstinent, amounts consumed. And all these measures, the psilocybin group was significantly better than the placebo group. And now psilocybin is being taken into a phase 3 study for alcohol dependence. Another thing we know is that the harms of psilocybin and other psychedelics are low. We have recently reviewed this, looking at the reported harms from the hundreds of patients, maybe over 1,000 patients now, who've been given psilocybin in the modern clinical settings. And of course, there's those 40,000 patients I mentioned before in the 50s and 60s. And you can read this paper, it's a free download, and it shows that essentially the harms of psychedelics are definitely low enough for them to be easily within the realms of adverse effects that we would allow in our clinical practice. And one of the reasons we can be confident about that statement is that expert groups from the UK here, from Europe, and from Australia, and more even recently from New Zealand, have looked at the harms of a range of different drugs when they're used recreationally. And you can see that all these independent expert groups came to the conclusion that psychedelics, even in the recreational setting, are amongst the least harmful of recreational drugs. So we can be pretty sure that when they're used in medical settings, those harms would be even less. And we know that these data have led to policy change. We know that from February this year, the Australian government, their regulators, said that psilocybin could be prescribed as a medicine for treatment-resistant patients from July this year, and that has happened. So that's the first country to allow compassionate use of psilocybin for PTSD, for treatment-resistant depression. They've also allowed MDMA for treatment-resistant PTSD. We also know that in several American states, magic mushrooms have been made legal. In Oregon, they are setting up wellness centers to use mushrooms to help people deal with the stresses of modern life. And we know also in America that there's a remarkable cross-party support for mushroom extracted psilocybin as a therapy. You see here, you have the Republican mushrooms and the Democrat mushrooms. One of the few things that the House agrees on is that psychedelics should be made available as soon as possible to deal with the massive mental health crisis in America. And it's very likely that MDMA will be licensed next year and psilocybin in a year or two after that. So what about the science? What do we think? Well, we're pretty sure that blockade of 5-HT2A receptors blocks the therapeutic of psychedelics, which is why when we use these drugs, we have to take the patients off 5-HT2A blocking drugs such as risperidone and olanzapine. We think that the cognitive changes are due to a disruption, a decrease in frontal priors. Psychedelics disrupt the layer 5 pyramidal cells, which create our anticipations, our predictions of the world, and essentially direct our thinking. Those processes are called priors. They're broken down by psychedelics, and we can see that using modern imaging. We believe that the increased mood is associated with increased connectivity across the cortex, what we call reduced modularity. We can see this using brain imaging techniques, that the brain is more flexible. People switch between different brain states more readily after a psychedelic trip. We've studied that up to 3 weeks after a trip in patients, and we've shown at that point, this increased flexibility, reduced modularity, predicts clinical outcome at 6 months. And when we're looking at SSRIs, the mechanism is very different. We know that SSRIs work to suppress the hypersensitivity of the limbic system, which is associated with chronic stress and chronic depression. So we have a different mode of treating depression with psychedelics. And we also think that the enduring impact of serotonergic psychedelics, which, as I've said, may last for 10 years in some patients, is due to a process we call neuroplasticity. 5-HT2A receptor stimulation increases the growth of synapses and dendrites, which we call neuroplasticity. And that can help people lay down new ways of thinking. People can escape from their depressive ideation. They can think differently about their past, plan a future which is less self-deprecatory, less, in the case of addiction, less focused on the love object, the drug. And that those new ways of thinking can become more enduring because of neuroplasticity. Now, we can show that in animal models. There's a lot of data showing this specific change in the structure of the brain through synaptic growth, etc. And we are starting to study that in humans. But we also know that a good outcome is likely to lead to be dependent on having a good experience. And it is possible that bad trips, because of neuroplasticity, will lay down enduring negative experiences or thinking. So one of the things that's critical is the set and setting of treating patients in an appropriate way with experienced professionals who can prepare them properly for the trip and the experience, and also help them deal with any of the stresses which might come from having a challenging trip. And the reality is most people with depression or addiction who we use these drugs in Their trips are challenging. They visit places in the past which they've repressed. They visit traumas which have led to their negative thinking or to their use of drugs and alcohol. So we have to help them work through those suppressed memories. I just want to show you this very recent paper from my group, which shows the process I mentioned to you. This is the first demonstration in humans of the disruption of frontal priors. On the left-hand side, in the bottom here, in this red box, you see the measurement of traveling waves in the brain. And normally, the dominant wave in the brain is from the front to the back. Those are the priors being sent back to other brain regions which are involved in sensory inputs. And the way we generate constructs of vision or hearing or touch or any other sensation is by comparing the sensory inputs with the predictive priors. So these are the backward traveling waves. And you can see under DMT, the traveling wave power is reduced and the forward wave power is increased. So hallucinations are essentially the forward activity of the visual cortex, which is altered as a result of the psychedelic and doesn't match with the top-down prior. So that's the first demonstration of this concept of disrupting priors. And then this is the data that supports what I told you about modularity. Psilocybin, and we've done this in 2 studies of depressed people, and we scanned them after the trip, not during the trip, because that would be counter-therapeutic. You see here the modularity, the differentiation of brain circuits is reduced. In this case, this is 1 day after a trip. The default mode network is less engaged with itself. It's more engaged with networks like the salience and executive networks. And this reduction in modularity predicts long-term outcome. Whereas in the comparison we did comparing psilocybin with escitalopram and SSRI, we showed the very classic impact of escitalopram. Escitalopram blunts particularly the response to fearful faces. It dampens down stress responses in the amygdala, but it also unfortunately dampens down responses to happy faces and all faces and neutral faces. And this blunting of responses, particularly to happy faces, explains one of the side effects of SSRIs, which is a blunting of emotional reactivity generally. And patients often find that less than ideal, whereas psilocybin has absolutely no effect on the emotional reactivity of the brain. So these are fundamentally different ways of lifting depression. And I just want to summarize them in this image here. This is a paper we wrote now 6 years ago, predicting that there would be 2 separate ways of lifting depression. The traditional way is the antidepressant way, which elevates serotonin in the limbic system. And through that elevation of serotonin stimulates the postsynaptic 5-HT1A receptor. That's an inhibitory receptor that dampens down activity in the limbic system. And it also reduces anxiety and impulsivity. And over time, the brain heals. And my analogy that helps explain the time lag of antidepressants is to make a comparison with a plaster of Paris and a broken bone. The plaster doesn't heal the bone, but the plaster puts the bone in a secure place so it can heal. It protects it from more stress. And this is what SSRIs do. They protect the brain from stress and they allow the brain to recover and heal. And that's why it takes 6 to 8 weeks for the brain to heal, because you have to recover from, in most people's cases, very long trauma. Psychedelics work in a different part of the brain. They work in the cortex, loaded with 5-HT2A receptors. They disrupt cortical entropy, the cortical synchrony. They cause increased entropy. That breaks down this rigid, inflexible, perseverative thinking that you get in disorders like depression and addiction. increases cognitive flexibility, and lifts depression as well as improves well-being. And we can show that both of those factors occur after psychedelics. And so now I'm very happy because for the first time ever, we have, for our patients, certainly with depression, an option to treat their disorder through different mechanistic processes. And that puts us in the same boat as disorders like hypertension and cancer, where we have known for decades that one treatment doesn't fit all, and having alternative treatments can improve overall outcome. What we don't know yet, well, we don't know a lot of things. We don't know the optimal duration of the trip. Some of the psychedelics that are used, like DMT, have very short trips. Some, like psilocybin and LSD, have long trips. We don't know which is better. We don't know why some people relapse after getting well. We don't know whether SSRIs or lithium, which didn't work before they had the psychedelic, could delay returning to depression. Could they be prophylactic after a psychedelic trip in the new, more flexible brain? We don't yet know whether psychotherapy adds benefit. It's absolutely vital for people to get through the trip safely and comfortably, but we don't know whether enduring psychotherapy will give better outcomes. We know it hasn't worked in the people before they've had the trip, but it might work afterwards. And we don't know exactly whether we have to stop SSRI. We know SSRIs blunt the effects of psychedelics. We know lamotrigine does too, but we don't yet know whether that actually blocks a clinical effect. We presume it does, but we haven't formally studied that. We also don't know whether the mechanisms in treating addiction are exactly the same as in depression. We haven't done the imaging studies there yet. And one of the most important areas is that the development of so-called non-psychedelic psychedelics, the development from animal work, which shows that you can produce behavioral changes in animals, such as in the forced swim test, with psychedelic-like compounds, which don't produce a psychedelic experience in animals. We do not yet know whether those will translate into human therapy. And we don't know also whether they work in addiction in animals. And the plasticity window, we don't know how long it lasts. We don't know how long it lasts for different drugs. We haven't yet worked out how to use it therapeutically. We don't really know how to measure it, but we're fairly confident it's there in humans. One of the techniques we're using to look at plasticity is EEG measures. We can use a long-term potentiation model to show that there's increased plasticity after the use of a psychedelic. And we can also use EEG during a trip to look at alterations in functioning, which gives an indication of the entropic changes. So I'm going to stop now. I'm sorry I can't be with you to answer questions, but if you want to send me questions, I would be pleased to answer them by email. And I'll just highlight a couple of books you might find helpful. The one on the left is a recent summary of psychedelics as psychiatric medicines, which you could find helpful. And the one on the right is my own sort of overview of psychedelics, and which goes through the history and the politics and the science, and also covers a lot of the very recent clinical work. So feel free to read those. And again, let me know what you think and if you have any questions. It's been a pleasure talking to you, and I hope to see you in person in the not too distant future. Thank you very much.
我们很谢谢来自伦敦大学的 Dr. Lemon， 因为Dr. Nutt， 因为我们的时间关系Dr. Nutt 因为时差没有办法 online 来跟我们做线上的 Q&A。那今天非常高兴我们邀请到伦敦大学 Dr. Nutt， 他是非常丰富经验。那今天分享的内容，我相信对大家都非常有帮助那以及也很感谢来自新加坡的李清教授，以及美国宾州大学王立山王教授都3个 speaker 都有非常 informative 的非常精彩的演讲。那前2位教授也都跟我们做了很好的线上的 QA 可是大家因为发问太踊跃了，我们时间有点 behind schedule 哈。那非常感谢今天三位座长哈，包含台北荣总的周云华主任，那高雄凯旋医院黄明伟副院长，以及台北荣总的白杨美白主任哈，都莅临现场。那也感谢我们现场参与的所有的贵宾，以及有很多在线上哈大家参加我们在 Webex 我们线上参加的精神医学的朋友们。那我想我们今天第一个 section 我们邀请的国外的学者哈这个 section 就要中间还是要做个 break 了哈，虽然时间有点晚了，那我们休息个大概现在是10点55分哈，我们休息个10分钟哈，我们是11点5分哈，我们准时回来。那我们等一下哈，还有接着还有我们国内的，包含像阳明交大的王立金教授哈另外还有3场非常丰富的lecture 在后面哈。那我们休息个10分钟哈谢谢大家。